Jeff Davis here. Thank you for joining us. I am with Nick Jonsson. Nick Jonsson is an author. He wrote a very well-received and best-selling book called Executive Loneliness. He is also a speaker, having spoken around the world, and he's a co-founder and managing director of EGN Singapore and Indonesia, making an incredible impact in the world. Share this very quickly. I first came across Nick through our mutual colleague, Andrew Bryan. Andrew Bryan is an incredible self-leadership expert. He's a professional speaker. He's an executive coach. And I was on a video call with Andrew, and I was telling him about all the things I'm doing in mental health as a professional speaker. And he said, Jeff, you need to connect with Nick Jonsson. And here we are. Nick, so happy to be talking with you here today.
Jeff, thank you so much for inviting me. And it's great that Andrew indeed linked us up. And I had the pleasure to work with Andrew quite closely the last 5-6 years here at EGN in Singapore. And what we do at EGN is that we are connecting senior executives and business owners in confidential peer groups. And Andrew has been a great supporter of that. He used to actually facilitate one of our top leaders groups by himself. And after that, he's been a coach, a mentor, but also a speaker at some of our high-level events.
That's fantastic to hear. He's very good at that. And I had a similar experience with him as well, as him being both a colleague and a mentor. And I also really like his genuine nature, and he's someone who's really making an impact in the world as well. So I'm very glad he connected us, and I see the resonance here for sure.
Fantastic, Jeff. No, I'm looking forward to see also what we can work on together moving forward. And the space, I think, of self-improvement, self-development has basically escalated and gone to the next level in the last 2 years, because before at least we were surrounding ourselves with colleagues and peers in the workplace. Now we have been working from home, and in some countries, including where I am in Singapore, there's still 50% of the staff only allowed back in the offices here. So people are still working, and many are still isolated at home.
Yes, that's a very big challenge indeed, with many being isolated. I'm curious, in your position as a co-founder and a managing director, you've won an entrepreneurship award in 2021 in Singapore. How do you manage that loneliness that can occur from this isolation of working from home? We've had COVID now for more than 2 years. How do you manage that? How do you deal with that?
Well, in my company in EGN, we have a 30 full-time staff now and 16 freelancers. Everyone is working from home, and that was already the case before COVID, so we're working remotely. We need to do a lot of things, Jeff, to engage our teams for them to stay close with us. Tomorrow night, for example, we're going out to have dinner with the team. We are still here in Singapore, only allowed 5 people, so we'll be 5 people per table, but a team dinner together to have some fun. But also on a day-to-day basis, we have set up clear KPIs, daily KPIs, weekly KPIs, monthly targets, all linked to incentives for the team. We have gamification elements to this, so people feel that we are all in this together. We are close together. We are joking, we are sharing, we're celebrating the small wins together. And I think that is so important. It was important before, but it just have escalated to the next level now when we're all working remotely.
That's excellent. You mentioned the gamification, and you mentioned getting that fun feeling of being together. I'm curious, how do you handle it when one of your colleagues might be having not only a really bad day, but they're struggling with something deeper, as is happening in the business world, these deeper root causes, these deeper challenges? How do you deal with someone like that, where you're inviting them out, you're including them in the culture, you're having them be more involved, and yet they're struggling, they're having those deeper challenges? How do you deal with that and try to get them a little bit more involved or to open up?
Well, it has to start at the top, Jeff. Everything here we're talking about is vulnerability, and you cannot expect a fresh graduate, a new recruit, or a middle manager to be vulnerable with the management to open up about their struggle and challenges unless you have been vulnerable first. So that is really what I do. I'm trying to be a vulnerable leader. I'm sharing if I'm having a bad day or if I'm having a tough time. So I'm very clear about that, and vice versa. We want to have an open, transparent relationships. It's based on trust, because people are working at home. There's no need perhaps to go down and see your doctor to get a medical certificate that you need to stay for home for 2 days from work when you're already working from home. So there's about give and take. More trust is needed all around, more vulnerability is needed, and this has to start from the top. We have to lead by example, and checking in with each other. Of course, it helps if you are in the same city. So many of our staff are based here in Singapore with, like me, and sometimes perhaps I catch up even for a lunch or a coffee. It can be on a weekday, but if they want to come and see me for coffee on a Sunday morning, I'm happy to do so as well. It is more challenging, of course, for staff we have overseas. We have staff in Vietnam, we also have staff in Indonesia, but I'm making an effort to go over to Indonesia to connect with the team there, both for one-on-one, but also for some team building lunches and dinners. Since we don't have the office environment together, we have to find other ways to connect.
That makes a lot of sense. I like your approach there, and you've definitely put a lot of thought into this. That's not something you hear every day in terms of a leader like yourself, a CEO, an impactor, an influencer, being willing to be vulnerable. And I'll say this very quickly. I recently put out a post on LinkedIn where I was extremely vulnerable, and I shared that I've been insecure, and I'm deeply insecure, and I've been that way because of various critics and haters. And people actually said they really appreciated the vulnerability. So I wanted to just quickly ask you before we transition into a bit more of your story and as we talk more about mental health, I just wanted to ask you, there are a lot of people who appreciate it and who resonate with what we are doing, Nick, you and I, putting ourselves out there, admitting those insecurities, being open about our challenges. And yet there are some people who are just not for us, who just don't resonate. We're not their cup of tea. Andrew Bryant says, I'm not for everyone, but who is? So I'm just curious, how do you deal with that where you have the vulnerability and there's some who resonate, but then there's some people who just really, really don't like it. They might disconnect. They might shoo you away. They might criticize. They might hate. A lot of people are dealing with that these days. How do you deal with that yourself?
I haven't seen it so much, Jeff. I would say probably 99.8% of all people have been very open, welcoming, supportive. I have seen one or two people. We have 600 members plus in Singapore. I can remember two people who said it wasn't for them. One actually said, great topic, but I'm not so interested in this. I got it all in order and I have other things to prioritize. Another person did indeed say, yeah, I want to terminate my membership because this is getting too much in the mental health space. And I was joining the organization because I thought it was more about top leadership and less mental health. So yeah, but that's very, very rare, Jeff. The most people are really seeing it as a supportive. And the way I put it here is that if you're not suffering by yourself, at least join these conversations, perhaps for your colleagues or your friends or your family members. You never know who's suffering in isolation. And Jeff, this is what I call in my book smiling depression, in that sense that you never know who it is who's walking around having a hard time. So when you take the argument like this to a business leader, what about, fine that you are great, but what about people around you?
I'm glad you shared that, Nick, because you mentioned the 99.8% there, and you explained that, and that's very good to hear that you are having those kinds of people gravitate towards you. So kudos to you for being able to have the insights and the leadership to pull those people towards you. In my experience, a lot of them, yes, resonate, and maybe let's say 10% do not. So I will say that I'm very happy to hear that you are having those right kinds of people gravitate towards you. That's what it's all about. And yeah, I would definitely say in my experience that as you keep putting yourself out there, you'll encounter more and more haters and more critics. So it's just a matter of staying connected to your core and realizing that there are a lot of people who value it, even when you get, like you said, that occasional person who either has something else going on, it's not their priority, or they just don't resonate.
I think you're spot on there, Jeff. And my channel has mainly been with the members of EGN here, but also it's been through LinkedIn where there are senior executives. I haven't done a TEDx, for example, like yourself, when you start to exposing yourself to a wider audience. Perhaps at that stage, I will see other feedback as well. And I mean, just to look at my book, the title then, Executive Loneliness, I mean, the people who look up this kind of book will be quite interested in the topic, and therefore perhaps I haven't been so criticized, but perhaps it's a good heads up, Jeff, that I need to be ready for this, because as the topic is spreading, and I'm on more and more podcasts in the US now, about once a week, more and more people are interested and open to have the conversation. So it's probably around the corner that some critics will come as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. You hit the nail on the head there. And who is better equipped than you? You have the tools, the insights, the skills. And your book, Executive Loneliness, I'd like to encourage everyone listening, or if you're reading the blog post right now as well, to check out this book by Nick Jonsson, Executive Loneliness. I highly recommend it. It's a huge value add. There are excellent insights on several levels, and it really can help you, whether you're an executive, whether you're at any level of your career, or whether you're just struggling even in life. There are going to be some insights in there that will help you. So I really wanted to give a shout out for that book, because that's exactly the kind of book the world needs. And I'm saying that sincerely, because this topic of mental health and of dealing with loneliness is so important, especially in today's times.
Thanks for that, Jeff. And yeah, I just had a look at your TEDx talk here before, and we have a lot of things in common in what we're talking about. And you're talking about how miserable people are when you see them driving to work and so on. And it's really true. And I mean, what I'm saying, we need to stop up in life and stop being so miserable, and instead looking at what are we grateful for in life, what is it that is great. And I have a personal program myself. I've been working on this, Jeff, and it's thanks from me hitting rock bottom myself. And only from there on did I manage to start to appreciate the beautiful things in life.
Yes, that's a good insight as well. And I can tell that you are putting a lot of thought into this, and you're showing up in that way that is really helping people. So on that note, I would like to transition into the next segment here, talking about mental health. This is one of the big reasons why we've connected and why we resonate with one another. We have several things to touch here, and we have some really good avenues to approach this discussion with. And folks, Nick Jonsson here, he has some of the best insights I've seen on this topic. So I'd like to start out, Nick, by asking you to share some of your own story as far as dealing with the loneliness, with the anxiety, with the depression, and even further than that. And I would love for you to share it and go as deep as you would like to go.
Sure, Jeff, and just like you, I was carefully considering which university to go to. I ended up going to Australia, as far away as I could from Sweden. I wanted to learn English, and that's where I found my little home, in a small university there, and that was the beginning of my international career. After that, I've been in various general manager positions for 12, 15 years, and I felt lonely quite a lot of the time. And I mean, the old saying goes, it's lonely at the top, and I could certainly feel it. Because if you're lonely at the top in a company when you're working in the West, imagine when you are stationed in Bangkok or in Jakarta and Ho Chi Minh City, where you might not even speak the local language. You don't know what people are talking around your back. They have different cultures and they cannot understand you. So in that sense, it's very difficult for you to be vulnerable, because perhaps they don't understand, and it's difficult to connect with the people. In that sense, I was very lonely in my roles. I didn't know how to deal with it, and I didn't have a good platform to discuss my challenges. My way to deal with it, Jeff, was to basically go to the bar after work and drink some beers. While that worked in the short term, the next morning I felt bad about it, and then the downward spiral started. So that's a quick summary of sort of more than 10 years of working under stress, extreme hours, and yeah, exercising was one thing. But when I didn't have time for that, it tended to be too often I went for a drink instead.
Yes, that's very good that you shared how you were coping with that by going for a drink, because a lot of people are doing that and they don't necessarily talk about it. So I have a couple things I'd like to ask you here about this as we go into it. And before we do that, I wanted to actually first ask you, as you were dealing with it by drinking, and as you were sinking lower and lower, and you fell into that depression, did you have a point where you thought like, okay, I'm really going to take my own life? Or was there always sort of like an awareness that you wouldn't do it? Or did you get that low where you were ready to do it, and it was a miracle that you didn't?
I came pretty close to that point, Jeff. And basically in 2018, I had gone down. Since 2016, I had resigned from a job because I didn't feel connected with the team. I had moved country again. I had gone through a divorce, which means my son, who lives with my ex-wife then back in Sweden when I was still in Asia, I wasn't really sure where was home. I was basically just jumping from one job to another. I had ruined all my finances, and I had started to gain weight and lost everything. So that was the point I was in. And I managed to then move to Singapore with the hope of getting better. I wanted to get better. And I can remember back in 2018 that my body was breaking down. I was too scared even to go to the doctor to see the blood results. So I took the ferry across to Indonesia to get the blood result. And it was terrible. The liver, the kidney, and the heart rate, and the everything else was so bad. The doctor didn't know where to start when they saw the result. And of course, that made me even more worried. So I wasn't suicidal as such, Jeff, but I was sure that I was going to drink myself to death or take medication to death. To the point where I signed up for life insurance. I wrote my will, my testament. I emailed that to my ex-wife. I even created an email for my son, who was 7-8 years old at the time, and I sent him all the documents, and I sent the details to my parents. I said, give this to my son when he's older if I'm gone. So I cleaned up everything around me, because I just didn't think I could go any longer. And my left foot was so swollen at this time that I couldn't put on a shoe. It was only later on, when I spoke to a therapist, I found out that was a psychosomatic illness. Basically, I had so much anxiety and stress inside me that it was bubbling up my foot. My skin was terrible as well from the drinking and all the lack of proper nutrition. So you can call it a slow gradual suicide, Jeff. My way of slowly, fading away.
Yes, yes, that's very good. And I'm very glad that you were sharing those details in terms of the vulnerability of the physical challenges that you mentioned, the psychosomatic effects, and how this was affecting you in multiple areas of your life. So listeners, please see here that you can see, as Nick is showing you, that there are many factors that can go into this, and that as you're going down deeper and deeper into those struggles, that you're going to have a lot of effects that may be happening from your various life, and that's very good to be aware of as well. So I'd like to go to the next step, or to the next stage. So you're there, and now today you're crushing it, and you are making a huge impact. So how did you transition out from these struggles and from the rock bottom? You have the physical challenges, you have the mental challenges. You mentioned you are writing something for your son. How did you transition from that to climbing back up that ladder and recovering? What advice would you give to someone who is at rock bottom, who is struggling?
Well, let's talk through those. And indeed, it didn't happen overnight. It was many steps. And the first step at that time was that I had met a woman who later was put to become my new wife. And I decided, when I was lying there in May 2018 in Singapore in the bed, and when I felt that I thought that life was over, and just after I've written my will and testament, I thought, well, I have nothing to lose now. So I tell her. So I just told her how I felt inside, and she was quite shocked to hear me, and she decided to then support me, and she gave me the backing to go and see a doctor to talk about my problems and so on. And then basically I also realized I had to address the alcohol. At that time, it had become an addiction for me. I needed to remove that. She then supported me, and we went to see a friend who had problems with alcohol before. This person connected me with an anonymous support group, and I joined some meetings there. And eventually then I was getting more and more sick, and I was even hospitalized actually at one stage. I needed to basically get medication to be able to break from the alcohol, because otherwise I would probably have died of the shakes and everything. But once I had the medication and so on, and I managed to break from the alcohol, and I got 2-3 days sobriety then in May 2018, I just kept coming back to these support group meetings, and I was there sharing my story. And for the first time in my life, I felt I was not alone. I could hear and feel immediately other business leaders sharing their stories, how they have struggled 3 months ago, 3 years ago, 20 years ago. There was people there willing to support and listen and hear me. And it was the first time I felt in my life that I really could sit here and share about my struggle, and someone would listen and understand. And I immediately started to feel better, Jeff. And instead of then drinking, I started to go for a walk, and I started to attend one of these sessions every day. And after 2-3 months, my life was looking so much better. But I was keeping this to this little circle, my new wife who I just got married to, and this group. I didn't tell my parents, I didn't tell any one of my friends. They didn't really know what was going on. I was shielding myself off from the world, even though I was recovering myself. It was only about 14 months later when a very good friend and colleague of mine in Singapore died of suicide. that I got completely shocked, and I decided to tell the world about my recovery journey. So that's when you started to see me popping up on LinkedIn, and it went completely viral around the world when I shared how I felt. And that was the beginning of writing my book as well.
You've definitely got the audience thinking here. This is the only kind of wisdom that comes from experience, clearly. And you've not only put a lot of thought into this, but you are able to clearly articulate and communicate these thoughts in a way that really, really touches people's hearts and souls. I'd like to touch on what you said in terms of talking about it. That is huge, huge. First, like you said, you walked us through climbing out of those pits and being able to have the guidance from your significant other and your girlfriend and then wife, and then of course being able to talk about it in these settings, and then from there sharing it more. My friends, we need to talk about this, and I really want to emphasize this, because the whole challenge is that our society doesn't want to talk about it, and it's very frustrating. And I'll go beyond the word frustrating. It's deadly, because people will die. They'll lose their lives because they felt like they could never talk about it. So I just wanted to emphasize that you did a great job to share this and to talk about it.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And I actually cleared this with my friend who then died of suicide, his brother. I cleared with him and got the approval of him. And his words, Nick, was to me, he said, Nick, shout it out loud. So that's what I did. And I mean, my book is dedicated to my friend Simon. And my forewords is written also about this, and it was indeed a starting, and we have to talk about it. As you said, it can be a matter of life and death here, that we have to talk about these things. We have to feel comfortable talking about these things. And after my LinkedIn post went viral, I was on radio within 24 hours sharing about it, and then followed a 4 pages feature, the biggest media exposure in Singapore's history related to mental health. And I was there on the full spread talking about this. And I immediately also managed to get other senior leaders, most anonymously, but sharing their stories. And it created this whole storm of media exposure here in Singapore, that people started to talk about it. And this is 2019, so before the pandemic. And then, of course, during the pandemic, this has escalated to the next level as more people have been suffering. And I donated then everything I did, and still today is donated to a suicide hotline here in Singapore called SOS Samaritans. So I set up a fund for this, and all the talks and everything I've done during this time has been donated to this. But more importantly, the awareness that we have this 24/7 hotline that do exist. And I've given it this hotline number to so many people who've been worried about their children, or even the parents the other way around sometimes, partners calling in despair, and there's at least help there. And there's so many beautiful organizations out there who is encouraging people to talk about it.
Congratulations on the media exposure, very well deserved, and that exposure is very needed. We need to talk about this, and your story is incredible in the sense that it's adding value, shattering stigma, and showing that there's nothing to be ashamed of. And when we talked a little bit earlier in this conversation about all those effects that were happening in your life, you had all those causes, but then you had all those effects in terms of the challenges and the struggles. These are things to not be ashamed of. These are things that happen to all of us. So the fact that you were able to have the bravery and the courage to put this out there is adding value to our world very much. And we will continue to talk about this. Now, I want to ask you something that was related to something we were chatting about offline previously, and I wanted to bring it up here for the blog post and for the video. Is there are a lot of executives, people in general, and including executives, who have these mental health challenges, and they may cope. You mentioned alcohol as a coping mechanism, also drugs. Remember you mentioned, and it really caught my attention because we're on the theme of speaking openly about it, that these executives will often not talk about it. They might be doing cocaine, they might be doing some other illicit drugs, they might be addicted to alcohol, and they're not really talking about it. And that really caught my attention, because I'm preaching to the world here, hey, there doesn't have to be a stigma if we just all talk about it, if we're just open about it. So I'm curious, what are you really seeing in the trenches, on the front lines of these executives who are engaged in incredibly illicit and destructive behavior with drugs and the gambling? and the prostitutes, but they're not really talking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did a survey in 2019 asking the senior executives in Singapore about these issues. And I did the same survey then in December 2020. And one of the questions were, if you're not feeling well, will you talk about your mental health issues with your company? 84% of the executives said that they will not talk to their company about it because they don't want the HR to know, they don't want the company to know, because maybe then they because we're talking here CEOs and managing directors, if they are showing weakness, then the company will perhaps not move them up for the next promotion. They will look for someone else to take over their job. So they will not talk about it. And then also another survey by Mental Health Foundation in the UK is showing that 75% of people also don't seek help for it. So that means we have 84% here not talking about it, 75% not getting help for it. So that means people are suffering in isolation. And that is exactly what I see, especially at the top, Jeff. The higher up the hierarchy you go, the less likely you are to ask for help.
We're really diving into it here. We're diving into your experience. We're diving into the wisdom. I want to focus on this for a moment here, and I'm going to ask you something, because it is so true that it is lonely at the top, even though it doesn't have to be. That you shared a very powerful statistic, by the way, that we need to shout out to the world. You mentioned, I believe you said 84% of executives feel like they cannot really share this with HR, which is their company, which is actually the opposite of what I preach, where I tell them to be open. What I want to ask you is, like you, I've connected with a lot of executives, a lot of CEOs, and some resonate, but there are some, and I'm going to be direct here out of pure love, some are just incredibly stubborn, that they refuse to be open, they refuse to share it. I'll even dare I say they refuse to change. And I want to harp on this related to your powerful statistic and story, because I'm wondering how we can approach those executives who are struggling, who are maybe even causing, through their dysfunctional behavior, their colleagues to struggle, but they just refuse to talk about it. They won't listen to Nick Jonsson. They won't listen to Jeff Davis or Andrew Bryant. How do we approach that? Because they are hurting people, and they don't mean to, they're not evil, but it's causing a lot of damage. How do we deal with people like that?
The only way is for people around them to be vulnerable with these people, because we can't, all these people are just so scared to open up, and it is that the people around them are also just like them. And I can share an example with you, Jeff. I have a lady who is part of my book who I interviewed, and it's a senior executive, a managing director for a bank, a lady, a woman who is the managing director for a bank, which is quite rare, at least here in Asia. And she had been suffering herself. She had lost her confidence, and after a cosmetic surgery in her face, and that led her to pushing her husband away. And at work, she started, as she said herself, she became bitchy. She elbowed her way up, and she performed well. She got all the promotions. She lived in an apartment. Her kids have nannies. She had the car driver, everything you can dream of, but she wasn't happy. When I interviewed her for my book, in the first interview, she shared basically what I just shared with you. A few days later, though, she sent me a message and asked if we could meet again. When we met again, she said, I want to be more open with you. And that's when she started to cry. She said, Nick, I rehearsed my own suicide twice. I don't know what I should do. That was the first time she had expressed this to anyone. Luckily, she was on the path and by getting better. Just like me, she had just told another human being about her plans or how she was. Of course, I encouraged her, and she then started to talk to her therapist, and her therapist encouraged to then get her husband in, and they had a conversation. They managed to solve it, and so on. And she's today completely recovered and feeling fantastic about it. But my point here is that her story was anonymously inside my book. And during the pandemic and the lockdowns, she ordered a copy of the book to all her team members and also her boss. And no one knew that it was her story in the book, but she asked everyone to read the book, and then they would have an all-hands meeting to discuss it. And in that meeting, she declared that, by the way, the woman you read about working in the bank in the book, that's me. And everyone was completely shocked. Here is this successful woman who's been the team and the boss for 8 years, who's been completely tough, showing everyone how great she is. Here is this woman who just told us that she rehearsed her own suicide twice. That was a complete turnaround for the whole team. What happened after that, Jeff, was the whole company started to have an open door policy where everyone felt comfortable to talk about everything. Her relationship with her boss, a man at the top position in the bank, was that he even came into her and said, by the way, I also went through a challenging time a few years ago. So that is what happens. It takes one courage from one person in a team or a company to open up in this kind of way and be vulnerable. And then the next one will come, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one. So that's what you do, Jeff. That's what I do here. We are sharing stories. We are breaking down the stigma here. And it doesn't happen overnight. But the people you are talking about who reject this message, maybe someone around them need to be that carrier, someone who they love, a friend, a colleague, or someone who then open up, and then they will also start to share their story. We all have struggles. The only difference is that some hide it.
Wow. Wow. You hit the nail on the head there. You really nailed it. That was a home run, and you address it very well. I think that that's an incredible story as far as the woman and featuring her in your book and the courage she had to step forward and then to inspire her colleagues. This is what it's all about. And this kind of experience is what is going to shatter that reluctance of leaders to really share. That's so important. So important. So as we continue addressing this, it's really about having the courage to be vulnerable. You mentioned it could be one person. So when we're talking about that underworld of executives, of businessmen and women, business people who are truly struggling, like you said, we're all struggling. It's just that not everyone shows it. The key is to have the courage to be vulnerable. And if you lead by example, something that you also do yourself and you have mentioned, we lead by example, that's going to create a ripple effect of hopefully helping more people.
Yeah, absolutely, Jeff. And it happens in our community. It can happen in your family, in your company, but it can also happen in your connection space. And I've seen this. I have a LinkedIn account where I'm very vulnerable, and you are as well. I have a Facebook page where I'm vulnerable. And as I open up more and more, I see the next day or the next week, someone else is vulnerable. Someone who is a business lady who I never seen any vulnerability before, suddenly sharing that she had a very difficult day. I took a half day off. I'm now here at the spa looking after myself. These kind of posts keep popping up. That means that if she done it once, and then all the people you see are making wonderful comments, get well soon, so good on you to be taking care of yourself. This is spreading, Jeff, and we just have to keep sharing, and it will come eventually.
This is very refreshing. Refreshing. Speaking from my heart here as well, this is not only adding value to our audience here today, it's also refreshing for me myself, because sometimes when I'm vulnerable, it's being fully myself, and it also causes some anxiety and uncertainty. You have people who judge, you have people who don't resonate, especially on social media I'm referring to here. So that kind of goes away a bit when you can get that face-to-face interaction, although it's still there, but especially on social media. But I still do it. You still do it. Others are doing it. Like you mentioned, people that you wouldn't even expect to do it are beginning to open up because of the value that it adds, because of the way it helps people, because of the way that it causes others to open up. A few years ago, I had a burnout. That was embarrassing, but I said, you know what? I'm not going to be ashamed about this. And I shared this on LinkedIn. That caused a little bit of anxiety because not everyone may resonate. Not everyone may understand. Some people may judge, but we have to be open. You do the same as well, openly sharing your story, openly sharing the stories of others as well. So we definitely need to keep doing this.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm in here in Singapore, in Asia, which is a more closed society than the West, so it's even harder here for people to talk about it. So me as a Westerner here need to lead by example and doing it first, and only them do they dare to start. And I even actually received a thank you letter from the mental health institute here in Singapore and the government body here looking after mental health last year for all the work I've done in this space, because they said we need more people like you who spread a message and who dare to stand up and say that it's okay to also not be okay mentally at every time.
Wow. Keep doing what you're doing. This is very, very needed. I'd like to ask you another question now, and it's something that we talked a little bit here when we were chatting a little bit before we hit record. You brought it to my attention, so kudos to you, and I would really like you to take the floor and to share. So a very, I'm going to speak very well of him, very powerful, very successful, and a good man, Tony. And please forgive me if I pronounce his last name wrong, Tony Hsieh, or you can say it better than I can. I'm familiar with his work. He's done incredible things in the world. And you mentioned that he died by suicide. And I saw that online that he did indeed die by suicide. This really caught my attention. Not only did I not know about this, but this is an example of someone who has succeeded. He even wrote a book about happiness, and yet the demons, the struggles of the pandemic, they got to him. I'd love for you to share more about this. I'd love to talk a little bit more about it, because that really, really stopped me in my tracks. My mouth hit the floor. I said, oh my God, we need to talk about this, because this is beyond tragic, and we need to prevent this from happening more in the future.
Yes, indeed. Tony Hsieh, the former, then the founder of Zappos, and I know him personally because I did some work with him back in 2013. I went over actually to Las Vegas. I joined his boot camp called Delivering Happiness, and the company I worked for in Indonesia at the time was also in shoe fashion. So we did some work together, and I was then blessed to join his camp. And I met him with Tony myself. I've been to his home. I had dinner with him and the team, and we had fantastic conversations. And I mean, for someone to write a book about delivering happiness, it was all about the well-being of employees, the core values of a company. It's about how you can have great relationships and be happy in your workplace. So I never met someone else who developed the company culture in the way that Tony did. So I was also completely shocked when I, in 2020 November, heard about his passing. I immediately reached out to our common friends in Vegas, and they told me that the lockdowns had hit him very hard. He started to isolate himself, and he couldn't obviously go out and be around friends. And Tony was what people didn't really know, but he was an introvert. And by the way, I'm an introvert myself. So what we introverts needs to do, we need to be very disciplined and schedule sessions when we do come out from our space and meet other people. And what I then heard was that Tony didn't do that. He had isolated himself and drinking too much drugs, and starting to play with fire and smoke. And he died indeed of the fire in the end. In one of his villas, not in the downtown where he worked, but somewhere up in the mountains by himself. So a very, very sad story of someone who had sold his company for $2 billion, someone who'd written about happiness, someone who I looked up to and who I thought was a role model for company culture and happiness. So a big shock to me and to everyone who loved and knew Tony.
I have goosebumps right now. I have goosebumps, because this is exactly the kind of story that we need to share. Very tragic. I send only love to Tony Hsieh and his family. He was a great gift to this world. He lived his purpose, and he also unfortunately had that tragic ending. So the more we can talk about these kinds of things, the more we can prevent it from happening, the more we can help people through their struggles. I'd like to ask you as well, if someone is at a point where they're about to end their lives, I know you mentioned this earlier when we were going into your story in terms of you were at rock bottom, then you came out of it. I'm curious if you had 2 or 3 main things to say to someone who's about to take their life. What would you say to them?
Well, the first obvious thing is to talk to someone, right? And I always say, Jeff, that we need to take a step back. We should never go to bed with something that's bothering us on our mind. We need to have those contacts in place so it doesn't go that far. That's where it should be first. And in my recovery program, we have to stay connected with people, and we have to call or message or connect with 3 or 5 people a day. And that is so important. So when you have those negative feelings before you go to bed, clear it. Because if you clear it on a day-to-day basis, then your conscience should be clear. And with this, I mean, Jeff is making amends. If you have sent an email to someone that wasn't the right tone, if you did snap at someone, make that amends before you go to bed. Clear it so that you have a clear conscience. Say that you're sorry. Say that you rushed the email, you didn't mean it. Make things right on a day-to-day basis. That is the first point. And indeed, the second one is pick up the phone or send a message to these people, but have these people proactively. I have people who I can call if I'm off. And in my program, we call them a sponsor. That means that someone I call if I feel that I don't know how to handle this situation. If I just done something that isn't good, I have a person I can call. And we need to have these people nominated. And you can make it with your best friend. It can go both ways, that you have each other, as sort of safety ambassadors for each other. And a third tool here is to send your gratitude list. Start each morning by writing down a few things you are grateful for. And again, you can send it to your buddy. Or in my case, I can send it to my sponsor. And I do that every day, to write down a few things that I'm grateful for.
That works very well. That works very well. Clearly, you've put thought into this, and you're seeing the effects of this both in yourself, this incredible network you've created, and the greater audience of the world. Those are very, very valuable tips. Very, very valuable tips. The gratitude, and I especially love, don't go to bed on it. Don't go to bed. Don't fall into sleep with that anxiety, with that unresolved whatever it is. That was spot on there, because I found in my experience, and others I've talked to, as well as I've worked with various colleagues doing what I do as an author and a speaker, that when they are more expressive, when they're communicating, and when they choose to not sit on it, but they make that effort to resolve it, more often than not, it will be well worth it. Well worth it. And even if it isn't worth it, you can at least have the peace of mind to know that you did all you could. So if you reach out to someone and you say sorry, you try to make amends, and they don't receive it well, Nick, what would you say is the best mindset to have in that case?
Well, just clean your side of the street. That's all you can do. And then you just move on from there. And rightly, as you say, Jeff, sometimes they will not receive it well. That's okay. But most often, you would be surprised that they didn't even worry about it. There was nothing for them. It was only in your mind. And you've been playing this in your head for a long time. And I did in my recovery program actually go back to make amends for things that happened in my childhood. One thing that we did in my recovery program was to really do a moral inventory, where we looked at, I had to in a spreadsheet write down every incident I could remember, when I was perhaps fired from a job, terminated from a job, when I had a fight with my sister when I was younger, and so on. I wrote down all these incidents and talked through it. And then when it was okay, to the instances when I wouldn't hurt the other person, I went back and made amends. And some instances was things that happened 7 years ago. I stormed off at dinner because something happened. My sister might have ordered a Coca-Cola for my son, and he was too young. I didn't want him to have a soda. And in my head, I carried around this pain for a few years, feeling that, that was a breakdown in the relationship and so on. And then when I came back to my sister to make amends around this, she couldn't even remember the incident. So here I was walking around for years with this pain, something that she had forgotten about right away.
That's a great example of how we can make those problems in our own minds. So case in point there, I'm very glad you highlighted that. And this is something that I also wanted to share as well, that you're doing a great job of, Nick, of taking responsibility for your side. Like you said, you can only clean your side of the street. We only have control over so much, and that's okay. That's the way it's supposed to be for our own lives. So for the audience, reaching out or doing your side or cleaning your street or saying what you need to say does not mean it may be received well. I've done contracting with companies and consulting, and there are a lot of unsafe people out there. There's a lot of great people in the world, and there's also a lot of unsafe people. It's a mixed bag. So if you're doing what Nick and I are suggesting and encouraging and advocating for you to do, and it isn't received well, remember that isn't on you. You have those challenges in your mind. It's okay to talk about it. It's okay to communicate it. Remember that you might be building it up more than it really is, and that it may also not always be received well by the other person. In this case, you have a wonderful sister, and I'm glad to hear that went well.
Yeah, thanks. And that's why we call this mental health. We need to practice this. It's like physical health. What do? Well, you go to the gym, you exercise, you work out for an hour a day. This is mental health. We need to practice this. We need to have these tools. We were not born with all these tools about cleaning your street, making amends. We're dealing with people. We're dealing with emotions. We're dealing with cultural differences and so many things that we have to just practice mental health, and we need to learn. And the best thing is to have these conversations the way that you and I have them, Jeff. It's about being honest and being vulnerable and talking about it.
Yes, it's an ongoing conversation. It's an ongoing practice. That is beautifully said. On that note, those are my questions here for you today, Nick. You have added a ton of value. I mean, this is just a gold mine. This is a gold mine. I mean, we could talk about this for hours, for days, for weeks, for months, for years, and we will, because we're going to continue talking about it on our LinkedIn channels, in our speeches, in our books, in our conversations. So this is very fantastic, very fantastic. Nick, any parting shots for the audience?
Yeah, thank you so much again for inviting me, Jeff, and for being a part of this important job we do to indeed get rid of the stigma surrounding mental health. And I just want to end on the last note again. If you have something on your mind, just ask. Just ask someone who is the right person for help.
Yes, yes. My friends, thank you so much for tuning in here today, whether you are reading the blog post or whether you're watching it on video. Really appreciate it. Would love to know if you have any kind of insights, if you have any questions for us, if you have any reaction. I'd love to know what are your struggles and challenges with mental health. Please share in the comments. And finally, I'd like to once again encourage you to check out Nick Jonsson's book, Executive Loneliness, The 5 Pathways to Overcoming Isolation, Stress, Anxiety, and Depression in the Modern Business World. Phenomenal book. Check it out, read it, share it with others. We need to keep talking about this.